Welcome to another edition of Grace Under Pressure, where my guest today is Mark Parsells. I will tell you all about Mark in just a moment. Grace Under Pressure is that show that deals with what's too often dismissed as the soft stuff, the caring, the commitment, and the courage we exert for others. And when you do it as a leader, as you will very much discover that Mark is, you do it with a singular purpose of bringing people together. Welcome, Mark Parsells.
John, thank you very much. Really nice to see you, and thank you for having me.
Good to see you. I want to tell folks all about you. You have such an interesting background. We know each other through 100 Coaches, founded by Marshall Goldsmith. And you have big company and consulting and venture capital experience. And so you are an ideal guest because most of what you know, I have no clue about. So we'll have fun. You are the founder and managing general partner of Montpelier Ventures. You've been a CEO. You're ranked right now on number 14 and climbing on the LeadersHum, a global power list of leaders. You coach CEOs globally, and U.S., India, Brazil, and Europe. And you build companies. You've been doing this for 30 years, which I really don't believe, because I think you must have been doing some of this in grammar school or something. So interesting enough, you had a little dabble in government. You served as a special assistant to United States Senator John Heinz of Pennsylvania. You are been on many, many boards, and including your own. And you did your BA, where my son got his MBA at Emory, and you did an MBA at Cornell. So very cool, Mark. Welcome to Grace Under Pressure. So,
thank you, John.
Great. Mark, you did a wonderful interview with our colleague, Molly Shang, and she referred to you as a business operator and so sometimes you could say business operator is shady, but she didn't mean it in regard to you. So what does it mean to be a business operator to you, Mark?
Yeah, I think, John, she was just referring to the fact that even though I'm an executive coach, I think she was referring to the fact that for my first 30 years, my experience was in general management. I coached people my whole career, but as a leader with P&L experience in Fortune 50 companies, as well as chair and CEO of PE and venture-backed companies, I really am an operating guy who then got certified as a coach.
Okay. You said something which I want to stop right at the end, because it's so typical of successful executives, and it's the operative word. I have been coaching, or I coach, and now, so for you to move from corporate and management roles to being an executive coach, I think is a relatively smooth shift. Would you not agree?
Yeah, it wasn't obvious to me until our good friend Marshall Goldsmith said it was obvious. So sometimes you don't see these things right in front of you.
Well, Marshall has an uncanny knack of bringing out understandings about ourselves that are obvious to others, but not ourselves. Hence coaching. So now I want to ask you two questions. You worked at senior roles at both Citi and American Express. What did you learn about management from those two firms?
Well, what I learned about management is, so the best companies hire the best and brightest, which is usually the biggest contributor to organizational success. But I also learned that even with the smartest people that are incredible managers, that groupthink and inward focused cultures often result in subpar and even poor performance.
Great. So that brings us to the flip side. So what did you learn about leadership from working at companies like Amex and Citi?
Yeah, so what I learned is that, so American Express, the cultures were different. American Express was like an extension of business school. Everybody was very smart. The meetings were kind of like a class in graduate school. People had the best decks. They were really, really well prepared, and they supported each other. And then at Citi, it was kind of the opposite, and not in terms of the talent, Everybody was incredibly well educated, but it was a little more of a Darwinian environment, right? And so when I stepped in to turn around their online banking business, I took over 2 organizations in this culture coming in from American Express, which again, this collegial culture, the one that was more backstabbing. What I realized about leadership was that if leader models the behavior that they want their leaders to employ, even if it's against the corporate culture, then you will get that behavior from your leaders, number one, and it will become not only a great retention tool, but a great way to attract other great employees within the company.
Great. I think you touched on this too, and it's a phrase that you mentioned with Molly, and it's the Emperor's New Clothing syndrome. What does that? How does that affect in a leader's ability to get straight talk?
Yeah, well, so I'm sure and I'm sure most of your listeners know of the literary folktale, The Emperor's New Clothes. It was by the Danish author Hans Christian Andersen, and it's about a vain emperor who gets exposed before his subjects. Literally, he's walking naked until a little boy says the emperor has new clothes, and the central theme of that is that it's a story about that illusion depends in part on self-deception of a group of people or individuals themselves, right? So at places like Citi and American Express, unfortunately, the Emperor's New Clothes syndrome, when I was at both places, was very, very real. And what I mean by that is, if a leader said, we're going to do X, Y, Z, and it was, like say it was your boss. Well, if it was from your boss, it was a great idea. If it was from your boss's boss, it was an amazing idea. If it was from your boss's boss's boss, it was a phenomenal idea. And if it was from the CEO, it was the best idea that ever occurred in the history of humanity. But does that sound familiar? And
never heard of it. Totally foreign to me.
but if a junior person came up with the exact same idea and no one had heard it yet, not only did no one pay attention, but often they would say, oh, that's a dumb idea. But as soon as a leader picked it up, all of a sudden it became that great idea. And I think that is one of the most damaging cultures that a corporation can have, and too many have them. At the end of the day, John, a good idea is a good idea, and a bad idea is a bad idea. Doesn't matter who it comes from. So I found that those cultures that value creativity and great thinking by their employees and reward the idea wherever it comes from are the most successful.
Yeah. And, some of the best examples of challenging authority like that actually come from our U.S. military, which is contrary to people who haven't worn the uniform, and I have not, but I have worked with folks who have. And it's the idea that every rank is encouraged to speak up. And speak out. And if you don't, things can go haywire. I mean, it doesn't solve all problems, but I think I think we're getting better at cultivating speaking up and out. What do you think about that, Mark?
Yeah, I think this latest generation is getting not only of employees, but of leaders. They've been trained in emotional intelligence. They've been trained, and they've learned the hard way that the way you succeed as a leader is to have employees and the next level leadership that are more competent, smarter than you, and experts in each of their functional areas. So if you want to retain those people, you have to treat them with respect, and you have to let them flourish as individuals. So I see that is very positive change.
Well, you just hit an operative word that is we often dismiss it to, and it's respect. It's simply having that doesn't. It's that idea of listening to those around us and quote below us and a ranking thing, and it's courtesy. It's simple courtesy, but it does so much. I know in helping engender a spirit and things like that, of working together. Now, switching gears a little bit, because now this is in your more current role, and you have this strategy for presentation that balances finesse and curiosity. Tell us about that, Mark.
Well, I think I think if I understand the question right, it's how do leaders effectively ensure that their leadership team and employees really buy in to what the mission is of your organization. And I think the best way to do that, like I was a turnaround guy. So I'd go in and to underperforming organizations and try to get them to be highly performing organizations. And, for those of us who have gone to business school, you have this thing called the business school case. And when students look at these cases, they say, oh, come on, this is ridiculous. The answer is really, really obvious. And, but again, that's a naive way to look at it. We learn when we get into business, because there's things like groupthink, corporate culture, and, it wasn't invented here. So in every turnaround, if I didn't see the solution in the first 5 minutes when it was explained to me, I wouldn't take the job. But I wouldn't go in and say, John and everybody, I have the solution. I say, here's what we're challenged to do. We're all going to get together. And in that case with Citigroup, which the dean of MIT actually wrote a case about, we stormed, formed, and normed in 1 week. And both leadership teams, because I was going to put two organizations together, they came up with the exact solution, but even better because they knew the organization better.
Right.
It was obvious to any business school case and obvious to me. So I think the way to finesse and ensure people buy into it, make them come to the solution themselves. And that way they own it and they believe in it. It's not your idea.
Right. And I mean, that's actually what I think both of us strive to do in our coaching, rather than quote, give the answers, is lead them to the water and discuss. And if they need something more concrete, we, of course, can deliver on it. But I think you also touched on something very important. When from the outside, solutions may be very apparent, but but when people are involved, i.e. culture and groupthink, it gets all confusing. And so that's where the wisdom of having worked with people before, such experiences before, give you the perspective to drill on that. So, you are a man of candor, and you say that you've, like the rest of us, you're not perfect. So tell us about an example where you were not perfect.
Oh my gosh. How many years do you have? So one I can think of is, and this is really important for leaders to understand. So I was going up to do a presentation to the CEO of Citigroup. I got in a big elevator at 399 Park Avenue, where our headquarters was. And there were about 30 people in the elevator, very busy. And I was completely focused on what I was about to say to a group of about 30, very senior people within the organization. So, I went in the elevators, it was a fine ride, it seemed like, nothing happened. 2.5 weeks later, my best person in strategic planning left the company. And I went to HR, I'm like, what happened? And he said, well, she said that you didn't like her. I'm like, didn't like her? I loved her. She was competent. She was friendly. She had a great way with everybody. What happened? She said, well, you were in an elevator and she was standing across from you and she smiled at you and gave you a little wave and you totally ignored her. And I'm like, I don't recall that. And that's the problem. I wasn't present. So when you're a leader, even these small things, they're seemingly small, they're not small. When I had thousands and thousands of people in my organization, and this person, I had told her how important she was, because she was, and because I interacted with her quite a bit. It was that one elevator ride that I wasn't present because I was too worried about what I was about to say in this meeting that I lost a great person. So
yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, that's a very powerful lesson, and it is the little things so often. And I think it's an extreme example, but especially since you had given her affirmation before. But it's how important that so often we get wrapped up in our own axle, and we don't take the time to recognize others. And when you're a leader, that's deadly. So, as you experience.
Yeah. So my only advice is for leaders: be present, recognize two things. One, recognize your impact, so be careful what you say. And the other thing to realize, your jokes really aren't funny.
We just had this discussion recently with someone, an ex-CEO, or thinking it was in our last meeting, and he was talking about telling jokes and things. And I don't know if it was me or you or someone, and said, well, when you give up the role, you're not going to be as funny as you were.
You're not as interesting or funny.
Yeah. So, well, I always remember too, it was Eisenhower when he left office, and as people know, he was an avid golfer. Yeah. And he said, I'm just not as good as a golfer as I was when I was president.
Exactly.
So that's right. So it leads to, you have a phrase, and I had not heard it before, but it intrigues me, called ultra transparency. What is that, Mark? So.
Well, like pretty much everything in at least my philosophy of management, it's just being honest with people. It's trusting that people can they can handle tough conversations. You need to respect their intelligence. If big changes need to happen, you need to, or at least as a leader, I found it was effective to be honest with people, tell them right up front, and respect their intelligence. And like at Citi, for example, where I had two organizations being put together, half of my leadership team was going to lose their job, but they were all shareholders. And we had a need for technologically savvy people throughout a 450,000 person organization. So we knew they would get placed, or we had great severance plans. So I said, half of you may end up without jobs, but do you want to be part of the solution and be involved in what is best for shareholders and you guys ultimately, because you're all shareholders, and then have the choice to select, what your future is? Or do you just want some guy like me who just entered in from another company to tell you what to do? And people, they don't like it, but they respect you. And ultra transparency is just telling people the truth and trust them.
I'm glad you talked about that. It is telling the truth is a matter of respect, because when you don't do it, it's disrespectful. And you're looking down. If you're in a position of authority, you're actually looking at someone as insignificant or not worthy of my time. And it's the worst thing, certainly not a leadership behavior. So
that's right.
Yeah. So talk to us about your work with Montpelier Ventures, which I think is a little smaller than Amex or Citi. So
just a little bit. Yeah. So yeah. I do three things, but so I do M&A. So I actually do some sell side and buy side, but the reason I do that, I only do 3 or 4 deals a year in lower middle market. And that's to help CEOs. In fact, all 4 of my deals last year, none of these CEOs had gone to college, but they founded these companies. They did well, but in every case, the worst case, I sold it for 3 times more than the initial offer. And the best, I sold it for 5 times more. I can go up against all the fancy M&A guys and stuff and make sure they don't lose their shirts. on selling what they've spent their whole life building. So that's one. Two, I sit on boards, but my primary focus is being an executive coach. And I focus on CEOs, presidents of major divisions, all the things that I've kind of done in my career, chairman and CEO of private equity-backed and venture companies, as well as partners of venture capital and private equity firms, because the reason it's important that they have a coach who's been a CEO is to help them understand how they can maximize the value of that portfolio company, because that's their job. And too often, the EQ of the partner is not where it needs to be. And you would think, well, CEOs, they're our leaders. They don't need to be handled in any special way. Absolutely not true. They're all human. And if you offend, you're dismissive, just like if the CEO is that way with their employees, you are not going to get the best performance from that person. And so I can really help the partners understand the scenarios that a CEO faces and help them think through the most effective way to work with them. Makes sense?
That's good. So I'm going to give you a chance to do a pirouette here. So why do people tell you they hire you? Are you an answer man or a behavioralist? What do they look at you as, Mark, and what do they discover about you? So
I don't think I'm not necessarily either one of those, although I have been trained in Marshall's stakeholder center coaching, which is behavioral. I think the best way to say why my clients choose me is one of my clients said, if being a CEO or a president of a big division is like skydiving, there's three ways you can do it. One, you could read a book, go up in a plane and jump out. Two, you could go up in a plane with somebody who's read a lot of books and gone up in planes and watch people jump out. Or you can go up with somebody who's read a lot of books and been jumping out of planes for 30 years and tether yourself to them and jump out together. And so it's more that I've been through everything. I've been through board fights. I've been through capital raises as the CEO. I've been through handling private equity, general partner issues. And I'm really a strong problem solver. So what I'll do, like we were talking about before, is I'll help them understand their options and let them come to the right conclusion.
Correct. Understanding the option. And I think as an outsider, I will say we often have greater clarity, not because we're smarter, but because we're not encumbered by the quote, cultural overtones or say baggage of an organization. Would you agree with that, Mark? So
I would agree with that 100%, John. And that's, I'm sure why you're a super effective coach. Not only are you brilliant and I love your books, so you have the wisdom, but the check will be in the mail, Mark. Well, I do. I do have grace notes here, so I'll give you a little plug. I love this. Well, I'm not kidding.
Thank you.
Right on my desk. No, but seriously, that I do think it's important. It's kind of like the business school student example. It becomes very obvious when you just read a case objectively. Well, yeah, that's the solution. It's very hard for each and every one of us when we're in a situation and we've been living it. Just like, you were asking me at the beginning of the call, how'd you become a coach? It wasn't until I talked to Marshall Goldsmith. He's like, look, dummy, most coaches have never run anything. And it really helps to have run something. Why don't you coach? I'm like, oh, okay.
Yeah. It sounds like Marshall. So getting down to cutting with clarity, you have a lesson that your grandmother taught you. What is it and how does it apply to our world? So,
well, it's funny. My grandmother was the CEO of a nursing home chain in Philadelphia, Chestnut Hill, where I was born. and in the 1950s through the late 1970s. And she had a really tough job. In fact, I used to walk with her when I was a kid through these halls with these seemed like ancient people then. They were like in their early 60s. Yeah. And
I know the feeling. So,
yes. And my grandmother was like 76, and they'd be saying, Mrs. Parsells, my leg hurts so much, you don't understand. And then, I remember one time after I walked through and talking to like 20 people, I said, Grandma, aren't you a lot older than these people? And she said, age is a state of mind. But I said, how do you do this every day? Because you have all these employees that depend on you, and, cooks and nurses and everything. How do you make it work? And she said, well, always remember, if you're a leader, remember three things: be real, be kind, and genuinely care about people. Because at the end of the day, leadership is just common sense. And we like people who treat us the way we want to be treated.
I love it. Be real, be kind, and genuinely care about others, which I can sum up with one word, which is called grace. And and sadly, Mark, we are racing through this half hour. And, I ask every guest a story about grace. Do you have one you want to share with us?
Yes, I have one story about grace. So when I was at Citibank, I was at the peak of my career. I had 53 countries. I was running technology as well as being the CEO of the U.S. banking business. And everybody said, you're on track to be CEO of this company in 10 years. But I never saw my wife and my two kids. And I felt a very, very strong need to not have those just be a checkbox, but to be a great husband and a great dad. And so I left the company in April of 2001 against everybody's advice. Even my professors, they said, you're crazy. I was going to run a smaller $60 million business that Hank Greenberg, the CEO of AIG, had started. But it was not just that I thought it was the right thing, but I felt I was trusting an inner voice that said, you have to move. And so I had to give up all my speeches. And one of my speeches was the keynote speech at the Financial Services Technology Conference at Windows on the World at 9 a.m. on September 11th, 2001. I had to give it up because I moved to insurance. So if I did not trust myself, if I did not trust in my greater feeling of the grace that somehow had come upon me, I wouldn't be here right now.
Wow, that is a story. That is a story of grace, actually a double thing, because you went by your instincts and then it all worked out. But the grace comes from putting family first, wanting to do what you wanted to do in conjunction, not either or. So powerful lesson, Mark. That's great. Mark, how can people find you? So
a number of ways. You can easily find me on LinkedIn, Mark Parsells. I have a website. It's under construction to make it a lot better, but it's MontpelierVentures.com. You can find me on LeadersHum as well, on the leadership power list. Those are three easy ways.
Great. Mark, it has been such an honor to speak to you today. I know you're a busy guy, but thanks for spending time with us today. So with that, I will close out, my friend. So
thank you. The honor's been mine.